I'll be introducing our speaker for you. His name's Dr. Jason Gibbs, and he's from the University of Manitoba, the Department of Entomology. He works on a variety of things related to wild pollinators, including molecular phylogenetics, taxonomy, evolution, ecology, and conservation. And he's done a lot of great things for Manitoba, particularly just introducing a lot more information about the species that we have present in Manitoba and how diverse it really is. So thank you very much, Dr. Gibbs, for being here, and I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for the introduction. I'm just going to try to share my screen here. If you give me just 1 second, and I just have to do a little tweaking here. Soft offices decided to pop things up. Okay. Okay, I think you should be seeing my first PowerPoint slide here. So it's very nice. Thanks. It's very nice that everyone has decided to sort of spend a perfectly serviceable night to listen to me talk about bees. I love bees very much, and this is going to be a bit of a whirlwind tour of the wild bees of Manitoba. Another sort of possible title for this talk might have been "The Fantastic Bees and Where to Find Them." And what I just want to kind of show is just the incredible diversity of bees that we have in Manitoba, tell you a little bit about the various kinds that we have. And there's a lot more to learn about these things. Currently, we have about 380 different species of bees that we've recognized from the province. That's up from about 250 or so from 5 years ago. So we've learned a lot in the last 5 years. And we're still learning more about it all the time because there's just a lot of uncertainty about the bees that we have, and just there's incredible diversity of habitats they live in. So I want to give you a little test before we start into the major part of the slides. So I want you don't necessarily have to announce it, put it in the chat if you want, but just to yourself, how many bees do you see on this slide? You take a moment. It's a bit of a trick. They're not all bees, but do your best guess. Try to figure out a number, and then I'll give you the answer. It's 2. So the first is right there, and the second is down there in the corner. That's a Euryglossina, which is a little tiny bee that lives in stems in Australia. It doesn't look very much like a bee. It has a very strange sort of body form because it has to slide into these tiny little crevices. Everything else that's an insect on that slide are flies. Unfortunately, this reprint of this book, The Bees of the World, somebody, an editor, not the authors, chose a very inappropriate image for the front cover. So we often think that we know what bees are, but sometimes we're mistaken, either by very tricky flies like this or wasps. So just to give you a little bit of a sense, bees are essentially just vegetarian digger wasps. Most wasps are predators or scavengers. The digger wasps tend to nest in the ground. Some of them nest in cavities, and they collect prey and they bring them back to the nest and they lay an egg on it for their larvae to feed on. Bees essentially do the same thing as digger wasps, except they've replaced insect prey with pollen. This particular digger wasp that's shown here is a bee wolf, so it specializes on preying on bees itself. So she's just trying to decide whether or not she's big enough to kill that sweat bee and bring it back to the People often think about honeybees when they think about bees, but this is sort of a global sort of survey of different flower visitors from various studies across the world. And the green part of those little pie charts represents the proportion that are not honeybees. So there are some areas where honeybees are dominant. In North America, things like the Central Valley of California, where almond pollination is predominant, honeybees are very abundant. But in a lot of other parts of the world, there are other bees that are doing a lot of the pollination services that we rely on. Bees are relatively diverse. There's over 20,000 species known globally. So this bar graph is just comparing that to the relative number of species of mammals, of birds, of reptiles. Bees far exceed any of those. There are only about 9 species of honeybees and about 250 so species of bumblebees. All the rest are different kinds of bees that live very differently. Here's a honeybee right here on an onion flower. And this little bee right here, this is a sweat bee in the genus Lasioglossum. Those are the bees that I'm spent most of my career working on. They're lovely little bees. We'll talk a little bit more about those in a second. So most bees don't sting. Either they're incapable of stinging, or their stings are too small to penetrate your skin, or they just have no interest in stinging you. Because unlike honeybees, I have a couple of wild boys in the background you might hear. You know, unlike honeybees that have these sort of massive resources that large mammals would prey on or feed on, most bees are not preyed on by mammals in any way. So they don't have the sort of defensive mechanisms to sort of deal with us. So they just ignore us, wait for us to go away. They're usually solitary. They don't have colonies. They nest in underground burrows. Very few of them are actually yellow and black. They're usually other colors, brown, solid black, metallic. We'll see some of that. And very few of our native bees make honey. Bumblebees make tiny amounts, but the rest are just collecting pollen and nectar for their individual larvae. And most of them we don't know nearly enough to say how they're doing. There's a lot of concern about bee declines, but very few species have been studied well enough, too little about their nesting requirements, the flora resources, to really make solid conclusions about how well they're doing. So this is kind of where I come in. My interest is sort of trying to learn more about bee diversity, try to describe new species where I can find them, and just sort of generally understand as much as I can about bee biology behavior as time and money allows. This is just a very quick survey of some of the different kinds of bees that we have in Manitoba. We'll talk more about these in some detail, as long as I have enough time. Sarah will kick me off whenever I've gone on too long. But they're, beautiful different colors, different shapes, and they all have sort of different life histories. They do different things. So most bees are nesting in the ground. This is a miner bee burrowing her way into an insect, into her nest. And most of these nests are abundant. We don't know, but you don't see them. They're pretty obscure. So this is a little Andrina barbarolabris. She's got a full load of pollen. You can see on her back legs, the yellow, and she's sort of landing in her nesting area. And she's going to land. She's going to walk over to her nest entrance, and she's going to crawl down into the sand, and then she's gone. And so that's what her nest looks like if you're walking by. So you have to be able to detect that little bit, maybe a slight gap in the dirt, but oftentimes the soil kind of collapses in on itself. So it's very hard to see. They're very hard to find. And if you want to study their nesting biology, where they spend most of their time, either as larvae or pupa, or just as sort of adults building nests, you can excavate that tiny little, you have to find it and then excavate it. And so it's a very tedious labor that very few people have done in detail, especially recently. So if you do sort of excavate a nest, depending on what kind of species it is, you'll find something like this. So this is a little ball of pollen with an egg laid on it on the left and on the right. One is from a sweat bee nest and the other is from a leafcutter bee nest. And the adult female provides that food, and then that's all that the offspring will have for their entire development into an adult. They often use a variety of different sort of nesting substrates and different sort of materials in their nest construction. Sweat bees and other bees will line the inside of the nest with glandular secretions. They have these big glands in their abdomens and glands in their mandibles that they use. And then things like leafcutter bees will, cut leaves and form those into a cell to protect their offspring. So this is kind of what development looks like. We have sort of an egg, and then it hatches into a larva, and then it will feed on all the pollen until it's completely full grown. Then it will pupate, and that's on the bottom left is what a bee pupa looks like. And just like a butterfly, they sort of emerge into sort of a beautiful sort of adult. So this is a sweat. But some bees will nest in cavities. This is a mason bee emerging from a cavity and an artificial man-made nest. The inside of their nests tend to be sort of linear. We have on the top, we have a mason bee nest, and you can sort of see this, the silken sort of spun cocoons separated by mud partitions. In the middle, there's a leafcutter bee nest, and so there's a series of different cells kind of stacked one on top of the other. And for comparison, on the bottom, that's actually a digger wasp nest, one that sort of uses stems in much the same way. And she's stuffed the front of her nest entrance with pieces of grass to block it. Not all bees collect pollen and nectar. This is a cuckoo bee. This is one that specializes on leafcutter bees. And they have some pretty interesting biology as well. So they don't collect pollen, they don't collect nectar. And some of these have really modified larvae. So this is a cuckoo bee larva. There's some diagrams and some sort of blurry images. But they have this one sort of instar during their development where they have these enormous manuals so that they can crawl over and kill the host bees, the larvae. And then later on, as they sort of develop further, their manuals go back to normal and they feed on the pollen and nectar. So it's not all nice bees on flowers in sort of the bee world. There's a darker side. And then in some parts of the tropics, there are bees that have actually resorted back to feeding on decaying material. This is the best picture that I could find one. There are a few species of stingless bees that actually feed on meat. Bees and sort of other insects have also been known to sort of feed on other sort of secretions from large mammals. So drinking sweat, that's why sweat bees get their name. And then some bees also will drink tears. So a few different examples of bees here. It takes a special sort of kind of person to sort of use their own eyeball, get a selfie of a bee drinking your tears. So there's a lot of concern about bees sort of dying. And maybe we'll get a little bit more to that in the background at the end if I don't spend too much time talking about bees. But if anyone has any questions about this towards the end, I'm happy to answer them as best I can. So the first group of bees I want to talk about, there's a lot of information on this slide, but you don't need to worry about too much. The little bars are just a very rough approximation of sort of what time of year you can expect to see them. So either sort of spring to summer or fall or kind of late summer. We have about 17 species of Cleides. They're cellophane bees. And on the right image, you can sort of get a sense of why they're called that. So their glandular secretions that they use to line a nest becomes a very thick cellophane-like material. And they tend to have, it's also very waterproof. And so their sort of pollen nectar provisions tend to be very watery. And so oftentimes some of the members of this family will actually have special sort of expansions in the larval form because they kind of float on the surface of these liquidy provisions. Some of it there's actually more sometimes than just pollen and nectar. Often these have a very distinct odor because there's actually associated fungi that will sort of feed on the pollen and sort of break down. And so oftentimes it might be, in some sense, the fungi that the bees are getting the nutrition from, not just the pollen and nectar. These are a combination of generalists and specialists. We'll see a lot of that. And in Manitoba, there's specific Cleides that will only visit either Dahlia or Campanula or some Ericaceae plants, Heuchera, Physalis, and different plants. So different species on different plants. And so if you want to find the full diversity, you have to sort of go to the right habitats and you have to look at the very specific flowers that each individual bee prefers at the right time of year. Closely related to Cleides, but not, they look very dissimilar. Is the only other member of the family Cletidae in Manitoba. These are known as Hylaeus, 14 to 15 species of those. There's still some ongoing taxonomic work by a student in Saskatchewan on this group. Some of them are exotic. They're originally from Europe. These tend to feed in cavities, stems, pre-existing holes. They also line their nests with these sort of cellophane-like material. But they have this very distinctive kind of bald wasp-like appearance because they're unusual for bees in that they carry all the pollen back to the nest internally. They have a specialized crop. So the one on the right, you can sort of see her sort of feeding on the anther. She's ingesting that pollen and she'll bring that back to her nest and regurgitate it. Another really abundant family we have is the Andrenidae. These are sometimes called minor bees. Also a lot of generalists and specialists in this group. Many specialists on willows, goldenrods, sunflowers, and a variety of other families I have sort of listed here. There's a really interesting one that only visits grass of Parnassus, and it's only a couple of specimens have ever been collected from Manitoba. And I've looked a little bit. So if you know grass of Parnassus, and you know a good spot for it, keep an eye out for a bee. If you see a black bee on it, it's probably that bee, and it'd be super cool to find. Here's an Andrena helianthe, a sunflower. That's a nice picture. I already showed a similar image to this, so I'll just sort of go through this. This is just another example of an Andrena digging into her nest. This one's a blueberry specialist. If you look at the inside of a nest, if you go to the effort of excavating it, this is kind of what you're going to find. This is a fairly simple tunnel that's going to lead off to some branches. Sometimes the cells are right off the main tunnel. Sometimes they have these sort of lateral branches. Sort of smooth surface of the cell. She's going to fill it up with pollen and nectar and lay an egg. So that's kind of the inside of a bee nest looks like. There's a few other genera of bees that are related to Andrena that are less common and less species rich. Two that I've listed here are Calliops and Protandrena. There's only 3 species of Calliops, and 7 species of Protandrena approximately. I have a student who's working on the taxonomy of this group because it's never been looked at properly. They have a really interesting behavior in that the males, when they mate, they remain attached to the female for an extended period of time. Presumably that's sort of a sperm competition effect, kind of protects, keeps the female from mating multiply while she's sort of interested. But she tends to ignore him during this period. So she just continues to forage and he just sort of hangs off by his bits. And yeah, and she just kind of walks around, flies around and completely oblivious. It's really fun to see, maybe you see it. One of the Calliops that we have is a really nice, pretty one with these sort of lovely bands on the abdomen, which is kind of unusual. This is a species which has never previously or officially been recorded from Manitoba. So there's no publication that sort of recognizes the species for the problems. But that's something we're working on. Another really wonderful little group of, are called the Perdita, or Perdita. They're quite small, maybe 4 or 5 millimeters long. These are all specialists. We have some that visit dahlia, some that visit goldenrods, bisalis, sort of ground cherry, has its own species. One on sunflower and one on willows. These can be quite abundant. In fact, one of the common ways that we catch bees is using these little colored bowls with soapy water in it. And probably this species here, Perdita swenki, is probably the most abundant one that we catch in some of our surveys. It can be really abundant. The next family I want to touch on is the Halictidae. These are the ones that I specialize in primarily. They include some really brilliant green metallic sweat bees. Actually, they're not that closely related. They sort of independently have the sort of brilliant coloration. One is Aluchlorella. These include some social species. So they have social development with queens and workers. And then there's also this Agapostemon. And so these are actually tend to be more solitary or communal. Communal nests are ones that are kind of like living in an apartment building. They all sort of live in the same nest. They all share an entrance, but they do their own thing when they're inside. So they sort of all independently forage and lay their own eggs. Whereas in a eusocial colony or a truly social colony, there's sort of a division of labor where one female dominates reproduction. And that's something that we see in this bee here, Aluchlorella. But because they're social or tend to be social, they tend to be present for a very long period of time. So you'll see them all through. As soon as bees are out, you'll see sweat bees, and they'll be present right into the very end of the season. And also, because they have such an extended season, they're all generalists, generally speaking. There's always exceptions. And almost all of them nest in the ground, although there's some that will also nest in sort of rotting logs. Another group of sweat bees are Halictus. These are also very similar, generalists, kind of social species. They have been known to sort of revert to solitary behavior at high latitudes and high altitudes. So it's kind of unclear how well their social behavior is in this group. This one on the bottom left, this is Halictus ligatus, probably the most abundant species of sweat bee in many parts of North America. But we get them very rarely, and it's a very well-known social species. So it may be it's too cold for it to sort of do its normal sort of social behavior. So it kind of drops off the very southern parts of Manitoba. It's pretty uncommon here, but everywhere else it's a weed, essentially. Then the most species-rich group of sweat bees, and these are the ones that I did my PhD on, is the genus Lasioglossum. That means hairy tongue in Latin, which is actually not that unique of a feature. A lot of these have hairy tongues. Most of these are generalists, but there are a few exceptions. There are some that specialize on primrose. So we have a couple of primrose specialists in Manitoba. Pretty rare, yeah, at least rare to catch, because you have to sort of get up really early in the morning to find those bees, because they only forage at the very sort of early part. As soon as as soon as the sun is up, they're done. And they have specialized sort of pollen collecting apparatus and their specialized hairs in their legs, so that they can sort of rake up the pollen of these primroses, because they're connected by these viscid threads. And so a bee have basically rakes and they can just sort of get all the pollen out in sort of one go. But know very little about those. We have very few captures of those in the province. This one up here, this is a social parasite. So these are also tend to be social species, although there are some solitary ones as well. But there's also a few of these sweat bees, these Lasioglossum, that have adapted to take over the nests of social species. So they go in and they live inside the nest, but they don't they don't do any of the work to build it. And there are at least 2 different species of these sort of social parasitic Lasioglossum in Manitoba that have been discovered in the last 5 years. Quite interesting. So they're called sweat bees because especially some of the smaller ones are known to drink sweat. So if you're on a hot summery day and you look down, you might find a sweat bee on it. If you ever feel a little sting from something as you sort of bend your arm or put your arm against your side, you probably caught a sweat bee, but generally harmless. They're probably getting some proteins and some salts and things from you that are harder to find in the environment. I've also seen bees visiting urine and scat and things like that. This is just another image of a sweat bee nest. This is one that nests in a rotten log. So certain kinds of trees, when they sort of begin to decay, excuse me, some of the material has a very soil-like material, and some species have evolved to sort of use that instead sort of soil assault. A couple of sort of distantly related species are Duphoria. These are unusual for sweat bees in that they're specialists. So we have 3 species in Manitoba, and they all specialize on a different plant. And then there's this is one of the most rare sweat bees that we have. This is pretty common in the United States. It's a big sunflower specialist, so it's about the size of a bumblebee. It's quite large. It's completely dark brown, black, but you can see this amazing collection of pollen. So it spreads all over the back of the abdomen and all on the underside of the abdomen as well. There's only one specimen of this bee that I'm aware of that's ever been collected in Manitoba. So it's definitely here, and it's a huge, distinctive species, but I haven't seen one in the province yet. So if you see anything that looks remotely like that, send me an email. We'll come running. The last group of sweat bees I'm going to talk about are the cuckoo sweat bees. These are sphacodes, sometimes called blood bees, because they typically have this sort of blood red abdomen with a black head and thorax. These tend to focus, they lay their eggs in the nests of either halictids or andrenids typically, sort of the digger bees or the sweat bees. So they're only visiting flower for nectar, maybe for a little bit of protein from the pollen for their own use. This is a really taxonomically challenging group. No one's ever really done a proper taxonomic study of this group. So we really don't know how many species there are in North America, let alone how to identify them all. So we have a sense of how many species we approximately have, but it's a big open question. Next big family is the Megachilidae. This includes the mason bees, the osmia. These are all solitary. Some of them nest in cavities, some of them nest in ground. Some have been found nesting in cow patties, pretty diverse. This species here is one that uses mud in its nest. So she's you can sort of see this, the female on the bottom has this big sort of collection of mud. So sometimes people thought they see a bee coming in and out of a nest, but actually they just sort of, they often visit the same site. So they actually tend to excavate an area, and you can sort of see that pattern in their nest construction. Some of these are, this particular species is actually often used as an orchard pollinator in parts of North America. So these are just a couple more pictures of different sort of osmia. Most of them actually use leaf pieces. They're actually not using mud so much. They're masticating leaves and sort of using that in their cells. So that's what most of our natives osmia do. Closely related are a couple other smaller groups. There's only a few species of these. Hoplites, which is very similar to an osmia, and Ashmeadiella. The only place I've ever seen Ashmeadiella is the Spruce Woods Park, so over towards the Spirit Sands, and it's a specialist on composite flowers. These are all solitary, but it's got this Ashmeadiella bucconus. It has a gigantic head. The species name basically means big cheeks, and it has a really big head for its body. The most common member of the, or most well-known perhaps member of the family are the leafcutter bees. So this includes the alfalfa leafcutter bee, which is an important sort of crop pollinator in Manitoba, but it's not native. Also includes some mostly generalists, but also some specialists. The one on the bottom left here is Megachilidae campanulae, which is a specialist on campanula. Also never officially been recorded for the province, although it lives. I've seen it, I've collected it on campanula just in my neighborhood here in Winnipeg. Some of them nest in the ground and some of them nest in cavities, but they all like to either use leaf pieces. So if you ever see anything like this in your garden, these sort of circular or elliptical sort of leaf cuts, that's a leafcutter bee. So if you ever see it, you can sort of, if you stick around and wait, you'll sometimes get to watch them sort of cut it. It's pretty fun. So that's kind of what it looks like. This is a ground nesting species. That's what it looks like if you sort of peel away the leaf pieces. It could be 30 or 40 different pieces per cell. So there's a lot of work that goes into each one of these. And that's sort of two on the bottom right, sort of stacked up on top of each other. And those nests, when they nest in the ground, they're often only a couple of centimeters at most underneath the surface. Pretty easy to excavate. And then others you can actually attract to wherever you want. They'll nest in sort of existing cavities, and so they're easy to watch and observe. Excuse me. I had class at 8:30 this morning, so I've been talking most of the day. The leafcutter bees have their own group of cuckoo bees, the cuckoo leafcutter bees, Steleoxys, and these are all brood parasites or kleptoparasites that are laying their eggs inside the nests of the leafcutter bees. Usually, there's always an exception. Another little wonderful group of in this family are the Ophidium. These are sometimes called the carder bees because they tend to remove plant trichomes and then use that as sort of in their nests. There's a couple of species that we have that are native, and recently this image that you see in the bottom right, this is Anthemium manicatum. It's a European species which has been introduced and now occurs in Winnipeg. But the other ones you sort of are sort of less commonly seen, generally speaking, unless you go to the right sort of locations. This is one that we don't have actually. This is another exotic, but we might find it soon. And you can sort of see it sort of working away at the bottom of this leaf, and it's kind of this sort of rounded kind of ball of trichomes that it's made. And in the bottom right is what a nest would look like, and there's multiple cells in there. Closer related to that is include the resin bees, and there's two different genera, Dianthidium and Harriotes, which do this, but they collect plant resins and they incorporate that, sometimes mixing it with dirt or small pebbles, and they attach those to the surface of rocks or in underground burrows, or they attach to the stems of trees. But they're sort of a unique group. We do have a few species of these. Sarah and a couple of colleagues, students, and I helped sort of show that there was actually 3 species, and people hadn't recognized these before for the province. And then there's just a couple of pictures of Harriotes, small little bees, only 4 or 5 millimeters long, but relatively abundant. And then there's also cuckoo bees that attack bees. So there are the genus Stelis. There's also a plant genus named Stelis, in case you're interested. But yeah, these are nesting, laying their eggs in the nests of osmium bees, so Osmia hoplitis, things like that. Also a bit of a taxonomic problem that had never been revised. And so we actually have about 7 or 8 species, but at least one of them is undescribed. And that's the one that occurs in the northern parts of the province. Then, of course, there's the bumblebees. This is the first member of the family Apidae that we'll talk about. Very abundant, very well known. They nest in rodent burrows, bunch grasses, and existing cavities. They're also social, so they have queens and workers. And there's also a few socially parasitic species as well. This is just sort of an example of some of the species that we have. Bombus impatiens is actually not really native to Manitoba, but there's a couple of images on iNaturalist and Bumblebee Watch, so public citizen science projects that suggest it's actually here in the province, but I haven't actually seen an individual yet. But that's a very interesting sort of, these sort of citizen science projects. So Bumblebee Watch is one, iNaturalist is another, where you can sort of post images and you sort of add to sort of knowledge of bee diversity. Bumblebees are good for this because they're relatively easy to identify. There's a very rare social parasite that whose host has sort of become in decline, and very few people have seen one alive at this point. But there were a couple of pictures of it posted, sometimes called Ashtoni or Bohemicus. There's some disagreement on the classification of its species, but it's been found up near Thompson, so it's still here in Manitoba. And so at some point, I'd like to go up and record. So if you have a camera and you're interested, either Bumblebee Watch or iNaturalist are ways of sort of contributing to bee diversity studies. Another little tiny, these are small aphids. These are I think 5 or so millimeters long. Are the Ceratina, the dwarf carpenter bees, and these like to nest in pithy stems. They sort of excavate the insides, and they sort of create these sort of partitions using the sort of sawdust. These are quite abundant. So if you have sort of blackberry stems or elderberry or something like that, you might have them. They're very easy to mistake for sweat bees. So the one on the left is a sweat bee, genus Laciglossum, and the one on the right is a Ceratina. So these often get mixed up quite a bit. There's also a group called Anthophora, sometimes called digger bees or flower bees or sometimes chimney bees, because they often have these sort of extensions to their underground burrows that sort of kind of rise up from the entrance. This species shown here is Anthophora terminalis. This is our most common one, and it actually nests in wood. There's a cuckoo bee for these as well. So this is a species that we first detected with some help from the Manitoba Conservation Data Center. Put some traps out for us. This is Brachymolecta californica. It's the only species in the genus known from Manitoba, and it's known from 2 specimens caught in a trap with a lot of Anthophora. It's quite a cool bee. It's actually relatively large, so it's about the size of a honeybee's. Another really rare genus, these are Diadasia. Could also be called thicker bees. They nest in the ground. These are all specialists. A couple of the species that we know are only known from one individual each, both collected in the spruce woods, and they're Sphaeralsia specialists. And I've been to this location where they were collected, and I haven't found any Sphaeralsia. So if you find Sphaeralsia gold mallows, again, let me know. I'll come running because it'd be really amazing to know more about these bees in the province. The biggest group of cuckoo bees that we have are the nomad cuckoo bees, the genus Nomada. These are red bees, or red and yellow, sometimes black and yellow, very wasp-like in appearance. And mostly these are attacking Andrena, the minor bees, or some halictids. And these are one of the biggest taxonomic problems in all of bees in North America. So if you look at the sort of the number of species and the richness, I have listed there. 18 to 30-ish, probably more. No one knows how to identify them. There's a student at York University who's working on them. Hopefully she'll make some good progress. Right now it's a nightmare. This is an example. This is a species here, which I originally identified as Nomada armenicola, which is sort of a prairie bee, a prairie cuckoo bee, originally described from Nebraska. But using molecular studies, we've sort of shown that actually it's the same as an eastern species, which looks very similar. So this is actually Nomada fertile. So we're always learning more about using various techniques to try to figure that out. But this like sandhills. So this was taken at the spruce woods. Another group of cuckoo bees, the Epioline cuckoo bees, which I like to call actually the smiley face bees, because the hair patterns on the thorax have a nice sort of smiley face. There's two different genera, Trioepilus and Epiolis. Not very diverse, but quite interesting species when you can find them. And these all, the Trioepilus, they usually attack longhorn bees, which we'll cover in a second. And the Epiolis are all cellophane bee parasites. But lovely little bees, I really like them. And this one, actually, I'm very excited about. This is Epiolis Gibbsi, which was actually named after me. Because I found it and I couldn't figure out what it was, so I sent it to the expert, and it was a new species, so he was kind enough to name it after me. It was only at the time when known from a single species from Canada and a few that were collected in northern Wisconsin in 1914 or something. So there was only one specimen, one Canadian specimen for a time from spruce woods, but we now have up to 3. So that's pretty exciting. So we're always looking for more of this. And we have no idea what the host is. We assume it's a Calides. We have no idea what species. There's a few other cuckoo bees. These tend to attack some of the smaller minor bees, Caliopsis perdita, maybe Protandrina. Hocoposites on the bottom left, which is a Caliopsis parasite. There's 2 species that we know of Manitoba. And this beautiful little bee up here, this is Neolara vigilans. Probably not actually Neolara vigilans, because there's another taxonomic problem. But it's maybe 3.5 millimeters long. It's tiny. I collected a few specimens up in the Spirit Sands. Spruce Woods comes up with a lot because it's an amazing habitat. Wonderful place. The longhorn bees, we're getting near the end. The longhorn bees, these are mostly composite specialists. They're mostly visiting sunflowers or coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, or whatever it might be, depending on the species. There's one that, in contrast, is a highly generalist, and it's even been known to visit corn for pollen. So it's so they're a pretty interesting group. They get their name from the males, which have these incredibly elongate antennae. And if you ever see, or lucky enough to sort of watch mating between longhorn bees, the males will often use these sort of elaborate sort of movements and actions with their antennae. It's quite interesting. And this is just sort of a lateral view of one inside of its nest. The white sort of is just powder that I blew down into the nest entrance to help me keep track of the path. But she's not very pleased with me. A little bit of pollen got left behind at the bottom there. Sometimes they have very lovely. This one's not particularly amazing, but some of them have brilliant blue eyes that you get sort of lost whenever you kill them and stick them on a pin, which I tend to do. But yeah, they're lovely, beautiful creatures in the wild. Here's just a few more examples visiting different flowers. So there's Agilis upper left, and Euryalus in the upper right and Trinotus in the bottom. And these are all different specialists on different kinds of composites. There's a related group, the Eucera. These are a little bit more spring bees. They tend to visit earlier blooming flowers. And there's at least a couple of species that we have, although they're very hard to identify. You kind of need museum collections to figure them out. So we're not entirely sure. There's one species we know definitively what it is, but the other one we're a little less certain, and there may be more than one. Honeybees we have, of course, but they're not native. This is what a honeybee typically looks like. They're not really yellow, they're orange, kind of, sometimes they can be quite brown. They're the only species in North America, I say the USA here, I borrowed this from a different talk. The only species that has this sort of really highly advanced eusocial behavior, where the queens and the workers are completely independent of one another. For example, in the sweat bees, if the queen dies, one of the other females can just take over the role of being queen, but that's not true in the honeybees. And the only one that dies when they sting. So most bees can sting you multiple times, but honeybees are an exception. So they're marvelous creatures in their own right, but they don't belong here. So if you're interested in bee conservation, the last thing you want to do is keep honeybees. Okay, the last one in this family, the second last in our sort of quick run through all the bees in Manitoba is Leafcutter. This is kind of quite an interesting bee. This is the Macropus cuckoo bee, incredibly rare, or was thought to be extinct for a long period of time until 2002, when it was recollected after about a 70-year hiatus. But we've recently recollected this in Manitoba, so it's here, it's present, it's persisting. There's a female on the upper part of the slide and a male on the bottom. So it's the only member of the genus in North America. So it's quite a lovely, interesting bee. And we'd like to know more about it and where it's living, and what its sort of habitat preferences are. Because this is a species that has been listed as sort of endangered. And its host is this. This is Macropus nuda. It's the only member of the family Mellididae in Manitoba. These are oil bees. So they only visit the genus Lysomachia, sometimes called yellow loosestrife, and only members of this genus that produce oils. So some of them have these special oil glands. And so she'll collect those along with the pollen and nectar. She has specialized hairs for that. And then she mixes that with the cell lining that she lines each cell with, and also mixes it with the provisions for her larvae to feed on. So this is, I looked for this bee for many years before I found it in Manitoba. So I'm very proud of these images which I took, because it was a long time coming to find this bee on its host, for me anyway. But it's a lovely bee, very different from most bees that we have in the province. But now I know a few places where you can catch them. So there's always new things to find. This is an older slide I sort of recycled. There actually isn't a second species. Recently, I got the opportunity to examine the specimen that was identified as that from a collection in Illinois, but it turned out it was just Macropus nuda. So there's only one species that we have. You can find these in July. And yeah, so I mentioned that already. Okay, I don't know how much time I have. What time is it? I can blather on forever. 7:45. So maybe, unless someone interrupts me, I'll just spend a few minutes talking about what we can do to help support native bees. It's pretty simple. There's 3 steps. You try to feed them, you try to give them a place to live, and you do your best not to kill them. So unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are enamored with the idea of having a lawn that looks like this, but I recommend against it. But if you do like a well-manicured lawn, this is essentially a desert for biodiversity. Put a lot of time and money and effort to making a lawn that looks very nice and green, but at the expense of everything else. If you do like it, you can combine it with some nicely curated gardens. That's going to be much better for bees. So a diversity of flowers, big patches of flowers, big as you can get. It's better than just having 1 or 2 sprigs. I'm terrible at this personally. I'm a terrible gardener. I have too much diversity, too much species, but not enough abundance in my own garden. If you're a gardener, you probably know that mulch is quite good, but my recommendation is also just have areas of your mulch that are not too thick to let those ground nesting bees sort of find their way down into the soil. This is just an example of a picture I took in a horticultural garden. Small patches are better than no patches. It doesn't matter how big your property is, or maybe you just have a windowsill that you can put a pot out at. Any habitat is better than none. And a lot of bees will forage quite large distances. They have a big kind of radius that they can sort of visit. And so it can just be one stop on their sort of larger routes. This is kind of what sometimes quality bee habitat looks like. This is actually a big nesting aggregation of leafcutter bees was found here. So I sort of did some studies of bees in this sort of habitat. It's just sort of an old kind of lane used as a path in a preserve. And there's lots of little patches of bare soil, some flowers, and those patches of bare soil were enough for bees to get into. They tend to like kind of well-drained, kind of sandy, silty type soils. This is something that we've sort of done in Manitoba. This is a pollinator planting that one of my students and colleagues have sort of worked to put next to some farmer fields in southern Manitoba. And we're trying to understand whether or not how that benefits bees and other pollinators and other beneficial insects. Unfortunately, they don't always look this pretty, but this is a particularly nice picture. But this is sort of what we'd like to help farmers do in some of their landscapes, try to make things a little bit more biodiverse so that they can get the benefits of that biodiversity and also help out the bees. This is something I've always wanted to do in my own property, but I haven't really had the time, or well, I'm too lazy is the answer. This is a bee spiral. This is something that was introduced by some European colleagues. It's just sort of a lovely little landscaping thing that you can do. Put in some herbs to be attractive for bees. And the idea is that you can have some different sort of soil moistures in that cell, and the bee in that sort of spiral, and the bees can find the spot that they like the best. Bee hotels are another sort of popular way to go about it, where you can just use sort of cut reeds, bamboo, blocks of wood with holes drilled in it. You can purchase these sorts of things, and some of the cavity nesting bees will come and nest in them. You tend to want something that's going to be a little bit deeper than sometimes you'll find in some of the major sort of big box stores. So I would sort of aim for about 15 centimeters, but sometimes, so I don't know, yay deep, but sometimes they're much shorter than that. And oftentimes they fill up with wasps, solitary wasps. So they're also not stinging, non-aggressive, some of these bigger wasp type things, and some distant relatives of yellow jackets, but they're not aggressive. They're feeding on caterpillars, and that's okay. So if you do decide to put out a bee hotel, or you found it's filled up with wasps, that's okay. That's good. We like those too. And I think that's it for me. I'm happy to take any questions. And barring questions, I'll give you a test. So.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We've got a whole bunch of questions coming in through the chat. So what I think I will do is just read them out so that they're hopefully captured in the recording. And so I'm just going to scroll back up to where we've got the beginning here. So the first question was, please explain further on honeybees and why they are not really wanted here.
Sure. It depends on your perspective, of course. So if you're a commercial beekeeper, my father was actually a commercial beekeeper in Ontario. And so if you want honey, then you want honeybees. So that's definitely something. So it's not an exclusively, they're completely bad, but they're not native. They were brought over by Europeans. So they're sort of a product of European colonialism. And they're an agricultural product, essentially. So it's kind of like having chickens. So if you like eggs, then chickens are good. But if you're interested in bird conservation, investing in chickens is sort of the wrong solution. So honeybees are not a conservation concern. Certainly, if you're a commercial beekeeper, a series of sort of pests and pathogens they've gotten, bromites in particular, but also things like nosema, are problematic for management. And so beekeepers have had a hard time in the last 20, 30 years because of that. But it's not a conservation problem. If all the honeybees died off in North America, from an ecological perspective, it'd probably be good. I want to eat honey on my toast in the morning, it's bad. And if you're a beekeeper, it's very bad. So the other issue with keeping bees on a small sort of amateur kind of scale is that you probably don't have the time, the money, or the skill to properly protect them from all those pests and pathogens. And so what you're instead doing is creating a pool for those pathogens and pests to sort of thrive. And then they could sort of pass those on to other bees. And you're just causing more problems for beekeepers. If you're really invested and you really, really want to do it, and you don't want to listen to me, University of Manitoba and our Department of Entomology has a beekeeping course taught by Rob Curry and some others. And so you should definitely take that course because that will give you more of the knowledge and background to manage them properly. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. The next question is, what type of bees pollinate tomatoes?
A variety of different bees will pollinate tomatoes. Tomatoes are actually an interesting plant. They fall into a group of plants that require buzz pollination. So the pollen is kind of deep inside the anthers and it doesn't immediately let itself out. Honeybees, for whatever reason, don't buzz pollinate. It's not, they should be physiologically capable of it because all it involves is this sort of vibrating the wing muscles, but they don't do it. So they're not good for tomatoes. Bumblebees, very good buzz pollinators. So they're very effective at pollinating tomatoes, and often they're actually used in greenhouse operations because you can sort of purchase, people have figured out how to raise and rear bumblebee colonies pretty effectively. So you can sort of buy bumblebee colonies, put them in the greenhouse, and they'll visit your tomato plants happily. But other bees will also buzz pollinate. Sweat bees, like the one shown here, are capable of buzz pollinating, and so they'll visit plants like tomatoes as well, and they'll be able to pollinate to a lesser degree. But if you want good, nice, big, juicy red tomatoes, bumblebees are probably your friend.
Awesome. The next question is related to pumpkin blooms. So someone's asking that they always see fluffy black bees visiting their pumpkin blossoms to gather nectar, and they're just wondering if you have any idea what type of bee that might be.
Fluffy black bees, entirely black?
Yeah, just saying black.
Take a picture if you can. It doesn't. Bumblebees are fluffy, but they aren't usually entirely black. And there's lots of bees that are black, like sweat bees that might visit a pumpkin flower, but they're not particularly fluffy. So that's actually one species that's not on my list, but could potentially occur here. There is such a thing as squash bees. It's an entirely different genus, and they only visit squash. And they do get pretty close to southern Manitoba, but they've never been collected here. What I really need to do is go visit a pumpkin field in the southern part of the province and see if I can find them. I've looked at pumpkins in Winnipeg and I haven't found any. Trying not to disturb the neighbors too much as I sort of peek into their flowers. But they're quite interesting. The males will actually sleep in the flowers because the females only forage very early. So the males hang out in closed flowers. And so you can sort of go, if you find a squash flower that's closed, you pinch it. And if it buzzes, you have a squash bee. Which you can do in parts of Ontario and throughout the United States, even parts of southern Quebec. But so far I haven't found them here. That's a digression. But.
Okay, this next one is a good one for all of us urban gardeners. What are the most common bees that we will find in our urban yards? And are they all generalists, or have any of them, do any of them have a particular desire for a floral diet?
It depends on what you have in your garden, certainly, whether or not you'll attract specialists or generalists. Where I live in Wolseley in Winnipeg, and I've certainly seen a combination of generalists and specialists. So some of the longhorn bees, Melisodes, I've seen those quite common, where people have various composite flowers in their gardens. Sweat bees are pretty abundant, but sometimes you don't see them very well because they can be quite small. The one I have on my screen is about 4 or 5 millimeters long, but they're going to be nesting all over the place. So if you look carefully, you'll find those. Oftentimes, I have some goldenrod in my yard, and especially in the late summer, it's just covered in sweat bees. Bumblebees are very obvious. You'll see lots of those foraging around, depending on what you have. I have a little bit of cherries that kind of grow on the fence row, and they're always filled with bumblebees in the springtime. Leafcutter bees I also find pretty regularly in my kind of garden. We have it's a bellflower, creeping bellflower. It's a terrible weed in a sense. It's very aggressive, but I have a shady yard, and so it's been here for I know how long. But leafcutter bees love that as well. And then also the minor bees. I've seen minor bees nesting in my yard. So that you get the full kind of diversity of bees to a certain extent. And so it kind of depends on what, if you happen to have willows in your yard, you probably have some willow specialists. But there are some bees that we have in the province which you can only find if you go to like spruce woods, or some of them are sort of more boreal sort of species, and so you have to kind of go to those kind of habitats. But there's actually quite a diversity of bees in urban gardens.
Great. This next question is about pesticides. So should gardeners be concerned about neonicotinoids, and what can gardeners do about neonics?
I mean, I guess you're probably, depends on what you're planting in your garden. Certainly, I would recommend against using them. If you buy plants, I mean, we should all be so lucky. I wish I had, could do this all the time. But in an ideal world, we'd all go and buy, native prairie plants. When the Living Prairie Museum has their sort of sale, or go up to the nurseries. They're available in Manitoba, and buy our plants from that, because those are the plants that are going to be best suited to Manitoba, best suited to Manitoba pollinators. But not all of us have that sort of option, and so sometimes you have to buy them from big box stores. And so you just have, those are the ones where you're most likely to encounter these. Maybe there's been some insecticides that have been used at the nursery stage that you might be unaware of. So you can ask, but probably you won't get a very good answer. But we all do the best that we can. So always aim for native plants when you can. A lot of the seeds that you'll sort of see for sale and sort of big stores tend to be just a mishmash of species from anywhere, often exotic, or at least not from this part of North America. So, but it's better that I'd rather see people in urban gardens plant some not so native flowers than nothing at all. Certainly, it's the cat is out of the bag to some extent. If you walk around my neighborhood, most of the plants that people are growing aren't native, but they're still supporting bees and other insects. So I don't know if I might have gotten away from that question a bit, but so I would avoid intentionally using any insecticides, but you might be forced into using them if you're buying plants from big major nurseries.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll just pull a few more questions from the list here. I know there are a lot of them, but at the end of the talk, we also have some resources that we can provide to answer some of these questions here. And we could always forward things along to Dr. Gibbs as well. So just for a couple more here, this question is, for restored or reclaimed prairies, is the limiting factor only vegetation? And will species richness improve over time in terms of the bees that may be present?
I would say yes, it should. I mean, there have been some studies that people have done on prairies. Sometimes they've used sort of a space for time sort of replacement. So, but yeah, when people have shown that whenever you restore prairies into sort of native habitat, actually the bees come back pretty fast. You do have to have, you do have to have a pool of bees for them to come from. So, I mean, if you were in a complete middle of nowhere and you put a little bit of prairie, you might not get the full complement of prairie bees that you might expect. But actually, sometimes, along railroads and things like that, there are corridors for some of these bees to persist. So, yeah, they come back. I think in Manitoba, I'm not sure that there's been enough research done on that kind of prairie restoration outside of some areas are probably pretty decent habitat anyway. But I'm thinking of someone just putting a prairie in the middle of what used to be a farmland. But that would be interesting to know. It'd be interesting to see how quickly they kind of come back. But bees are pretty, bees travel pretty good distances. They're pretty good dispersers. Some bees are remarkably efficient at finding their host plants. So sometimes you catch and traps bees that are specialists on sunflowers, and I can't find the sunflower to save my life. But the bee was flying by and found our trap. So they're pretty good at doing what they need to do. Yeah, I hope that answers because you can re-ask it if I didn't get to the thrust of it, the crux of that question.
Okay, thank you. So last couple ones here. Do you have to manage store-bought bee houses? I've heard you have to clean them out and do the larvae over winter.
It depends. So I mean, I'm a low impact gardener. I'm a low impact kind of bee manager. So I mean, yes, you could do that. And there are different ways of different philosophies about this. So I know some people who are kind of opposed to the use of bee hotels. They would rather instead that you just kind of use kind of cut stems from vegetation and kind of leave those out for a year and then sort of replace them with new cut vegetation next year. So you just sort of, as you're sort of managing your garden, you're just sort of managing it in a way that's helpful for bees. And so you're looking for plants that will have stems that are suitable, kind of naturally suitableness. And you just allow those to sort of replace themselves sort of naturally. And that's a perfectly sound ecological advice. I always think of bee hotels more of as sort of an educational kind of learning experience. So if you leave them unmanaged, they'll accumulate all of the things that prey on bees, right? So you'll get parasites sort of will build up, and you might get some other things happening. Personally, I find that kind of interesting. So if it was just a little bee hotel and just a bee coming in and out, that would be interesting. But if it was a bee and you could also see the little parasitoids trying to lay their eggs inside the bee nest, well, that's even more fun. So it's, but if you want to make it a little bit nicer for the bees, then yeah, you can sort of replace the reeds. You could, if you have reeds or bamboo or whatever it might be, you can also buy straws to put in sort of wood nests that you can sort of extract. Then yeah, you could sort of remove the cocoons and do things. Some people, commercial operations will clean them. You can either clean with sand, or you can use like a very low dilution sort of bleach solution and sort of wash them. When they're in the cocoons, they're very resilient. They're actually basically adults by the end of the summer. So if you go towards, whenever it starts to get cold, there's no more flowers and the nests are done, they're all going to be living in these sort of little hard protective cocoons. If you actually open up that cocoon like September, October, it would be a perfectly formed little bee in there. So they're just going to hang out. And so they're perfectly resilient. So you can do all kinds of stuff with the cocoons and they'll be fine.
Okay, so we'll do one more question for the night. This question is about your photography. So this person says that your photos are amazing and they're wondering if you have any photography tips for taking pictures of bees.
You have to take about 10,000 really bad ones, and then occasionally you get a really nice one. That's my trick. But I think it's as elaborate as you want. So I use I have like a Canon SLR, and then I have a macro lens that I attach to that, and then the light. It's all about. It's kind of your. I'm not a very good photographer, but you're basically kind of painting an image with light, and so you can sort of manipulate light using flashes, or you can use natural light. A lot of these were taken with natural sort of sunlight, and then you can use shutter speed to sort of kind of freeze the image like it's here. So you have a very quick shutter speed that'll sort of freeze motion. But then you have to compensate for that to make sure that there's enough, because the shutter speed doesn't let much light go in. So you have to compensate for that by sort of changing the way the aperture is, because the size of the aperture will let more or less light in, but that has an effect on the depth of field. So you'll get a smaller area that's in focus. And so you just have to play with those kind of elements. There's also something called ISO, which is mostly sort of a digital version of it, but there's basically a kind of from film at how sensitive the film is. And so low ISO is less sensitive. There's less noise, and so it'll give a darker image. But you can also have a higher ISO, which will give you more sort of noise on the image, but will work better in low light conditions. And so you just have these sort of three variables, not including the background light. You just sort of have to play with those until you find the right sort of framework. If you go on a nice kind of semi-cloudy day where you don't have direct sunlight, that's where you get the best images. It's nice diffuse light. It works really well. But you can find all that stuff if you just explained better on YouTube.
Okay, well, this was absolutely fascinating. It's always wonderful to see a great overview of all of the diversity that we have in this province, particularly our pollinators. And I'm sure, like, as
number of bees we have.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Oh, I learned a lot.
yeah, so I guess one thing I was going to mention is that I realized that there are a number of questions that we didn't quite get to, but there is a fairly recent resource. It's a website called BeBetterMB.ca that has a lot of information that Dr. Gibbs touched on here, including native plant lists, growing information, information about pollinators in general and their conservation, garden tips that support pollinators, and a variety of resources and links that help you kind of get on your way to creating bee habitat at home, at school, at a business, whatever it may be. So I think it may be a good supplement for some of the things that you learned here tonight. So I guess to wrap up, thank you all so much for being here to learn about bees on your Tuesday evening. Thank you very much to Dr. Gibbs.
Yeah.
All day was able to join us. And thank you again for the donation.
I'm not gonna, mess up down, pull some down below.
Yeah.
Oh, I think someone's just not on mute right now. But the last thing to mention is that there is another session coming up on February 8th, and it's about the prairie birds of Manitoba, and it's an opportunity to learn some bird identification and where you can find some of these neat birds throughout the province. So the link is live on the Living Prairie Museum website, as well as the Friends of the Living Prairie Museum website, if you'd like to register for that. So once again, thank you all, and I hope you have a great evening, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Okay, so I can put